Thank you. Good morning. First, I'd like to thank Father Kyle and Cale, and everybody at Villanova for your wonderful hospitality. It's a pleasure to be here. Also, I had the good fortune of knowing a former recipient of the Mendel Medal. He received the medal over half a century ago, and that was George Spurty. And George Spurty is an interesting individual. He is the inventor of frozen concentrated orange juice and Preparation H. And an interesting scientist, very important to the financial stability of the institution where I teach, Mount St. Joseph University in Cincinnati. So, without further ado, let's get some definitions out of the way. Apiology. Apiology is the scientific study of bees. It's different from apiculture, which is the raising of bees by providing them with an artificial cavity in which they can build comb, where the queen can lay her eggs, the workers will produce the brood, and honey, and pollen, and that we harvest for our own uses in some cases, hopefully leaving enough for the bees to survive. And so Mendel was a competent apiculturist, but his contributions to apiology are what I'm going to try to focus on a little bit this morning. And also as a theme, a little over a year ago in the American Bee Journal, a paper on the genetics of the honeybee was published. And it said there are three people that are critical to understanding of the genetics of the honeybee. And they included Gregor Mendel, Charles Darwin, and Johann Dzierzon. Now, there should be a name that you haven't heard of before, but so my goal is to touch base on all three of them as they relate to this understanding of bees and Mendel's work. Well, Johann Mendel was born, as I just mentioned, in 1822, and he passed in 1884. He was born in, I don't know if I have a pointer here or not. I think I do, Brian. Right up in this area here, there it is, in a place called Henschitze, and it's a small farming area. His father was a peasant farmer. He was born in this place here. His father owned some land, and he grew, in addition to some legumes, it's possible that he grew peas. They talk about leguminous plants being produced in the area. He also had apples, pears, plums, and cherries. And this is also where Mendel had his first introduction to bees. When the property was searched after Mendel's paper was rediscovered, or discovered in 1900, people went back and looked at the homestead, and they found there were 2 log hives. And it's believed by many that indeed his father would have had bees because he had an orchard, and therefore this would be important for pollination. Now these log hives that we see that are common in Eastern Europe are really a fascinating process involving forest beekeeping. And for forest beekeeping, what was done is amazing. They would find a very straight tree, tall preferably. The beekeeper would climb up the tree, cut a door, and you can see the door in this one that's not been put down on the ground, and then hollow out a space. They would crawl another 5 or so meters down. If there was at least keeping 5 meters from the ground, they would do it again. And if the tree was tall enough, they would have 3 beehives in one single tree. They'd cut away the branches so during a storm and any kind of rain or heavy wind over, because that hollowing out the tree would make it quite weak. Eventually, this forest beekeeping, and of course, tools for the forest beekeepers were very different than the tools that we use today. It included a crossbow, because one of the major pests of honeybees were bears. And so beekeepers would carry ladders, and they would have bags and a crossbow as part of their arsenal. Unfortunately, we don't do that anymore for those with keepies. Any beekeepers in the audience? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Excellent. So it's thought that, and what happened is people are stealing the honey from these trees. The idea was then to cut the tree above and below where the bees were, take back the log hives, set them up in an area that becomes an apiary, and now the beekeeper can protect his bees from theft. We also have evidence that the school that Mendel attended as a child also had bees, and that the children were probably taught some of the basics of beekeeping, since this is part of a way that a child can help their parents. Well, Mendel entered St. Thomas's in 1843, and he was ordained in 1847, and his real forte was teaching. He did do present Mass, and he tried to comfort the afflicted, but that was not one of his strengths. Indeed, teaching turned out to be much something he enjoyed a lot more. And he went for the teacher's examination and did not pass. I'm not going to go into all that detail. But fortunately for him and us, his failure at that exam, which was the graders allegedly said something that he was denied the fundamentals of study, was the recommendation that he attend the University of Vienna. You know, had he passed that exam, we may not be here this morning. It's hard to say. He enrolled in 1851 at the University of Vienna, and you'll notice on the report card that Ed showed, he got a 5 in zoology. That's because he dropped out of zoology early. He dropped zoology and enrolled in entomology, the true science. And he took entomology from Vincenz Collar, who was famous as an economic entomologist. And this is the translation, the English translation of his major work, the treatise on insects injurious to gardeners, foresters, and farmers. Now, Collar was specialized clearly in economic entomology, that they would call it today. But like Mendel, he was born on a small farm in Moravia. Even though Mendel was older than the other students, this geographic connection also connect them in the classroom because of the age difference, I think, as well. I bring this up because, like myself and a lot of my colleagues, Mendel's first contribution to science was on an insect pest. In 1852, while on break at the Abbey, he collected some caterpillars that were feeding on radish plants. And with Collar's help and encouragement, he reared them out, got them to the pupal stage, and discovered they were what we now call the mother of pearl moth. It's a pearlid moth. And this was the first time this species had been known to be a pest of radishes. He wrote this up in a short paper, and the following year, in 1853, read it to the Vienna the Natural History Society, and that was published. That's his first contribution to science, was an insect pest. So already this association with Collar he had this reward through his observations. He returned to Berlin in 1853, and there at that year there was a major outbreak of the pea weevil on the pea crop. Indeed, some of these peas were going to market, and they were heavily infested with this beetle. And so he decided to follow up on the research that he had experienced in the joy he had, I think, in publishing the first paper on mother of pearl, by doing a careful analysis of the pea weevil. He examined it carefully, found a little black dot, which he surmised correctly was where the female inserted the egg, the ovipositor, to lay the egg. He noticed as the larvae developed, a black disc formed on the other side of the pea, and he correctly predicted that's where the adult beetle would chew its way out of the peas. And this was written up in 1853 and read by Collar to the Vienna Society and was published as a second paper. So now he's got, I think what this did for Mendel was it told him that his observations could lead to new discoveries, fundamental discoveries. Peas were a major economic food source in the area. So this was something very important for Mendel. Of course, what happened, he did not complete his teacher's examination in 1854 and returned to the Abbey, not successfully passing. And if you've not had the pleasure of visiting, you've got to go to the Mendel Museum. This is where Mendel grew his peas. And up in this area here, you can still find the foundation of the greenhouse. For us, for my wife and I, it was like going on a pilgrimage. You sit there and you think about it, and you say, that's where the peas were grown. It just makes the hair back to the next stand-up. That's where Mendel was doing all this. So it was quite an interesting process. Now, and here's the meteorological structure that the records are also taken as well. My first introduction to Mendel is probably the same as you, in high school biology, where a biology teacher terrorized you with dominant, recessive, true breeding. Remember those Punnett squares? There's this tic-tac-toe device and ratios, 1 2 to 1, and 3 to 1, and 9 3 3 1, and so on. Well, for those of us in biology, it's elegantly simple. But a question that's been asked, where did he get that idea to do crosses? And then look at the ratios to come to his conclusions about what was happening in the inheritance. When he returns back to the Abbey in 1854, that's where he's going to stay. The first thing that starts happening to him is he sets up the beginnings of a research program. But at the same time, we have a possibility of where he's getting his ideas. It was Conway Zirkel, a professor from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, a very interesting botanist and historian of science, has strongly suggested that Mendel got his experimental design from Johann Dzierzon. Now, Johann Dzierzon, how many of you have heard of him before? Just one? Excellent. How'd you hear of him?
Just in Mendel readings.
Okay. And so it turns out Dzierzon was born in 1811, died in 1906. He was born in Lockwitz in Upper Silesia, so it's only 140 miles from Mendel's birth. He was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1834. He said he was Polish by birth, but German by education. Because his family spoke Polish, but he went to German university. He kept bees as a child, see a parallel here, and after he was ordained, he continued to keep bees in log hives. But he wanted to be able to have more control over his bees. He wanted to see what the bees were doing. So he was reading up on the literature, and there was a number in the Ukraine. We see a series of box hives being coming out of the Ukraine, so he's decided to start modifying beehives and create one out of boards. And here's Dzierzon a little later in life standing next to one of his more modified hives. He first equipped these boxes with boards, bars at the top, and then later equipped them with frames. He didn't incorporate the critical bee space, which Lenzer Langstroth did here in the United States in 1851, but he had a movable frame hive, just the same. And indeed, he's considered the father of rational beekeeping or scientific beekeeping. Now, to give you an idea of Dzierzon's reputation, in the 1860s, Charles Darwin, while researching honeybee variation, wanted to contact Dzierzon to ask him some questions. Darwin carried on incredible correspondence. We have now 15,000 letters to and from Darwin being published in sequence by the Darwin Correspondence Project at Cambridge University Library. So Darwin was unable to find an address for Dzierzon. So he decided to write an open letter to him, which he sent to Thomas Woodbury, who was a major beekeeper in England. Woodbury also was a publisher of Beekeeping Journal. And Woodbury then sent that letter from Darwin to the Bienenzeitung, who in turn forwarded to Dzierzon. Dzierzon answered it, and they published the response in the Bienenzeitung. And I don't know if you can see, but here's the word Charles Darwin. Here's the question. Darwin starts out by saying, I would be most gratified if the Reverend Dzierzon would be so good as to clarify whether or not there's a marked difference between the ordinary bees, Apis mellifica, which are kept in various regions of Germany. Dzierzon responded, and what he says is short. He wrote, to the inquiry of Mr. Charles Darwin, I reply with pleasure, although owing to want of time, I can do so but briefly, and not so particularly as I wished, and the question merited. And then it goes on for like 2.5 pages in multiple columns in the publication. Darwin, indeed, when he published this information in his book Variation of Animals and Plants in 1868, wrote, the great Apiarian Dzierzon, in answering to my queries on the subject, says that in Germany, bees of some stocks are decidedly dark, whilst others are remarkable for their yellow color. See Darwin Variation. So Dzierzon was who Darwin turned to for help on honeybee races. And in the Variation of Animal Plants, he goes into the origin, essentially the history of a whole range of plant and animal species, domestication, and so on. And he turns to Dzierzon for help. So Dzierzon was well known throughout Europe and even caught the attention of Darwin. Well, while we're speaking of Darwin, let's take a brief moment to talk about Mendel and Darwin. It's clear from the literature that Mendel was certainly interested in Darwin's work. But we can say that Darwin did not inspire Mendel's experimentation. Mendel started to develop his strains, pure strains in 1854. He started his crosses in 1856, 3 years before The Origin of Species was published. So the initial reasons for doing his work was not involving Darwin. We do have, however, at the library, at the museum, a copy of The Origin of Species, which has on the back, in Mendel's handwriting, a list of page numbers. Mendel read The Origin of Species. And these page numbers, if you go to those pages, you'll see little pencil marks along the margin describing things that Mendel found of interest. For example, in the historic sketch, and this is the second German edition was what Mendel had, which is the translation of the third English edition. That was the first edition that had Darwin's historical sketch. And right next to the line where Darwin said, creation is a process by which we know not what. There's a little line. That's the only theological thing you see there. Because the rest of his marginal stuff relates to wherever Darwin mentioned peas, Mendel marked that. Wherever he mentioned Gertner and Kohlreuter, two major references in his paper on hybridization, you find that mentioned. And then one passage is really interesting. Darwin says, if you take two dissimilar plants, and cross them, that first generation looks like one of the two plants. But when those are subsequently crossed, you get increased variation. This is an interesting subject that deserves more examination. That's dominant, recessive, and the hiding characteristics and the reappearance of the recessive forms. Although Darwin did not look at it the way Mendel did, Darwin and the others in his day would basically cross plants and look at the whole plant, not at specific traits. And whatever struck them is what they would comment on. So the idea of dominant recessive, at least, was well appreciated by this time. Now, Mendel also had a copy of the German edition of Variation of Animals and Plants in Domestication, but he clearly didn't read it. The first 5 pages are cut, but the rest of the journal is uncut. The rest of the book is uncut. So it's in the library, but was not read by Mendel. So we know that when the publication that talked about Darwin being of interest to Mendel, it was Mendel's interest, particularly in the idea of domestication and selection, that seemed to attract Mendel's attention. Indeed, we know from a letter in 1873 that Mendel wrote Nagli. He said, this is the English translation, about different hybrids of plants. If that were the situation, we would have to attribute the spontaneous hybridization of hawkweed to temporary disturbances, which, if often repeated and becoming permanent, would finally result in the disappearance of that particular species, whereas one or another of the more favorably organized hybrids, which might be better adapted to the existing conditions, might succeed in maintaining itself in the struggle for existence and in continuing for long periods of time until ultimately it too would suffer the same fate. It's a nice paraphrasing of natural selection. So it's clear that, at least to a number of authorities, that Mendel accepted natural selection, wasn't opposed to Darwin per se, but he's not going to jump out of his way to bring that in. But we see a number of letters like this, and Hugo Iltis in his biography that came out in the 30s said that the nephew made the comment that the word Darwin never passed his uncle's lips. We actually have Mendel citing Darwin by name in his correspondence. So it's something we need to look at even further. Back to Dzierzon, and now what is going on with these races. So he's the father of international beekeeping. He's interested by Darwin, of course. Mendel might have an interest. And what caused all the interest for us is that in 1845, Dzierzon made a rather controversial observation. Some background. Honeybees have 3 castes. There's a reproductive queen that produces the next generation. You have female workers, sterile workers, and male drones. What Dzierzon observed was he had a hive where the queen had a deformed wing and could not go out on her mating flight. But she still stayed in the hive and she laid eggs. And all the eggs developed into male drones. So he proposed in 1845 that drones were produced from unfertilized eggs, and he published it in the Bienen Zeitung. This is the issue that his description goes in there, and it was met with an incredible controversy, because in the 1840s it was believed that both sexes contributed equally to the inheritance of the offspring, and that this violated this concept of how inheritance should work. And indeed, he vigorously defended his views for the rest of his life. And it wasn't until the end of his life and when it was possible to do chromosome counts. It was found that the queen and workers had 32 chromosomes and the drones had 16, that we knew for a fact that Dzierzon was right in his observations. So this is 1845, it's based on this one observation, but he wanted to test it. And he wasn't able to test it until 1853, when Dzierzon was able to get a colony of Italian bees. This is the typical black German bee that Dzierzon was using, and with this yellow Italian queen, he was able to have essentially a visual phenotypic marker that would help him understand if he was correct in his views. So, his first cross. He took Italian queens, crossed it with a German drone. He also did the reciprocal. He took a German queen and crossed it with an Italian drone. And in both cases, all the offspring that were drones were 100% what the female's phenotype was. So if you had an Italian queen, all the male drones were Italian. If you had a German queen, all the offspring German drones showed the German phenotype. The queens and the worker bees were intermediate between the two. It's pretty good. But he went further. He took one of these hybrid queens, clipped the wing, and it started laying eggs. And what's really interesting, I thought really cool, is she starts laying, half of her drones are Italian, half of the drones are German, a 1-to-1 ratio. But it doesn't stop there. He mates the Italian queen, and if he's correct, the drone parent, the male parent, will have nothing to do with the genetics of the offspring. That should continue, and indeed it does. He got 1-to-1 ratio of Italian and German drones from even the crosses. And this he published in 1854. That's an important date. And in his own publication, the Bienenfreund aus Schlesien, and that's a major beekeeping publication read in the region of Brno and the rest of the area. Now, it was Hugo Iltis who wrote in 1832, quote, Mendel, one may presume, was acquainted with a hypothesis which at his time was being hotly debated among beekeepers. One propounded in 1854 by the Silesian parish priest, Dzierzon. 3 years later, Whitting carries on with this and points out that it is also of interest to note that Dzierzon was aware of Mendelism, or segregating heredity, 12 years before the publication of Mendel's paper on peas. In 1854, Dzierzon stated that drones of the second generation of a cross resemble either the paternal or the maternal race, and that these two types occur in equal numbers. He therefore glimpsed the fundamental gametic ratio. Now, note the year that Mendel's coming out with, that Dzierzon has published this, is 1854, the same year that Mendel's returning to the Abbey and is setting up some of his experiments. So, to paraphrase something we talked about in Watergate, what did Mendel know, and when did he know it? What's the link? Is there a link? Can we put them together? And the missing link is Abbot Knapp, the Abbot of St. Thomas, the Abbey of St. Thomas. Abbot Knapp was born in 1792, died in 1867. He was elected abbot in 1824, and at that time there was an imperial directive that the abbey should be training teachers. And he himself was trained as a theologian. He was a gifted professor or teacher of theology. But the bishop ordered him to stop teaching because they felt that he wasn't attending to the financial stability of the abbey. So he stops teaching, and he decides to improve the abbey estate's financial situation by introducing rational means of farming. He did this by recruiting Franz Diebel, a professor at the Brno Philosophical Institute, to help bring in all sorts of methods of agricultural production. He was very much interested in hybridization and the contribution of the sexes in crosses. And he was very successful in encouraging selective breeding in sheep, and indeed we see the wool production improved to the point where wool production accounted for 73% of the abbey's income in later years. Now, he's a theologian, and he's now completely immersed in agricultural issues. He gets caught up in insect pests and worried about the economic return of farmers due to the loss of insects. He's elected president of the Pollological Society, involved with apple orchards and fruit production. He even stated in 1836 that heredity was best studied through physiological experimentation. What this is all in point to say is that Knapp really had an interest in inheritance, and had an interest well before Mendel even shows on the scene. Mendel is still 7 years even from joining the Abbey. So, what did Mendel know about Dzierzon? Turns out in 1853, Dzierzon attended the Vienna Congress of Beekeepers, where he presented a large discussion on his new modified hives, which would increase honey production, and he also talked about drones coming from unfertilized eggs. That was in 1853. In 1854, Knapp decides to set up the Beekeeping Association within the Brno Agricultural Society. We also know that 1854 was the year that Dzierzyn published his account, his experiments with the 1-to-1 drone ratios. We don't have the evidence that the paper was received, but it was the premier publication in beekeeping at the area. It is believed that Knapp set up this society in part to promote rational beekeeping, to hopefully do with bees what he had been successful at doing with sheep production, increase the economic opportunity of people living in the area. That same year, 1854, Mendel most likely set up beekeeping at the Abbey. That was the year he also started buying seeds, pea seeds, to start developing his pure breed strains. It was 1856 that he did his first experiment on peas. So we've got the circumstantial evidence that Dzierzyn was at least interested in, was covering the material that Knapp had an interest in, and Knapp, for example, was promoting Dzierzyn's hives. In 1861, Dzierzyn published his book titled Rational Beekeeping, and we know there was a copy in Mendel's library. We don't know what year he bought it, but we know that he had a copy. But the ultimate was that happened in 1865. 1865, the 14th Congress of Austrian and German Beekeepers was held in Brno. In September, it was organized by Abbot Knapp. In fact, he presided as chair over that conference. We know for a fact that Dzierzyn attended, and that Dzierzyn accepted the hospitality of Father Knapp to stay at the Abbey. There are only 11 friars. So if Dzierzyn's having his breakfast and dinner at the Abbey, would he have seen Mendel? Well, Mendel was living there that very week. He was teaching that day. He did not attend the conference, but he was in the building during the morning and the evenings of those days. We know a lot about this particular meeting because it's rather historic. It's where Major Hrushka demonstrated his new honey extract, the idea of spinning frames at high speed to get the honey out. And so that was a major discovery. Here's Hrushka on the far left. Here's Dzierzyn, the photograph taken about that time. So now we've got Dzierzyn in the building with Knapp. Of course, the timeline here, this is after Mendel, this is the same year Mendel presents his paper. He's already done his experiment, but this shows that there's a possible connection between the two, that indeed Iltis and Whitting and Zirkel were probably correct, that Mendel did know of Dzierzyn. Whether he influenced Dzierzyn experiment design, we don't have that smoking gun yet, because Mendel did not cite Dzierzyn in his paper. But would he have cited a paper on bees in a publication on peas? That's what we don't know yet. But we have good evidence that indeed Mendel's work on bees was influenced by Dzierzyn. This is also a time of transition. Abbot Knapp died in 1867. Mendel was elected abbot in 1868. And as abbot, Mendel's apiology now could expand. He was in charge of finances. He could influence a number of things. So let's put this all in a timeline for Mendel's genetics work. We've already talked about in 1853, he does his mother of pearl moth on radishes, pest paper. He does the one on the pea weevil in 54. Starts to breed peas, develop true breeding strains in 1854. Likely started bees at St. Thomas based on Knapp's encouragement to to bring in the Dzierzyn hives into the region. He starts his crosses in 1856. He presents his paper in 1865. And at that paper, we all know the story, there wasn't a lot of reaction. It could be in part that mitosis hadn't been discovered yet. It could be in part that it was very rare for mathematics to be part of a discussion in biology. There were two disciplines. You didn't take necessarily biology and chemistry and all these things. You might take natural philosophy, which is math, astronomy, chemistry, and physics, and natural history, which is geology and biology. That may have been part of it. It also may be part that mitosis hadn't been discovered for another 20 years. That may contribute. He sends a copy of his paper out to a number of, at least 2 or 3 individuals. One of them vaguely suggests that he start doing the same thing with the hawkweed. So he tries up the whole thing. Tries to set, the hawkweed is a relative, it looks like a dandelion, it's a composite. And very small plants, small structures. He complained about hurting his eyesight by trying to get the crosses going. But it was doomed to failure. The hawkweed is apomictic. apomictic, it produces seeds from unfertilized ova. It was never going to work. So the ratios didn't happen. He didn't get the same results. And he publishes that in 1869. At the same time, after he's now working with the hawkweed, that's when he starts doing some more of his apiology. In 1870, he joins the Moravian Beekeeping Association, which is what the society that Knapp developed, organized in 1854, morphed into. And interesting enough, he goes on as a representative of the organization to the Beekeepers' Congress in Kiel, where Dzierzon was in attendance. On the way, he visited Dath to get a colony of northern German bees in a Grevenhorstolpen hive. It looks like an upside down, the photograph, it looks like an upside down mailbox, but it's actually a straw hive that's got frames that are worked from the bottom. Here's one of the frames that would slide into that hive. And so he brings this back to St. Thomas's at this time. And then in 1871, he builds his bee house. This is a beautiful facility. It's made of brick. It's got a 90-degree angle. Here's the honey house workroom study here in this end here. It's got a nice high volt ceiling. You could extract honey in this room. It overlooked the openings to his beehives. There were 15 openings where you could have bees, the hives facing outward, and this looks down onto St. Thomas's. Behind back, this is really cool. He actually dug a winter storage room into the hillside. He was interested in acclimatization of bees to stop bee kill or bee loss in the winter. So a lot of people, especially in Europe, Europe and England, had winter storage facilities, usually in barns, that they'd bring the hives in and put in there to protect them over the winter months. He actually had a really nice one built into the hillside behind the bee house. So all this activity with the bee house being built is thought by Orell, Darwin's one of his modern biographers, that Mendel was interested in using bees as a model of animal inheritance. He knows for a fact that Dzierzon got ratios when he crossed them. He didn't get the ratios at all with hawkweed. This may be a nice subsequent test of what of Mendel's ideas on inheritance. Orell suggests at this time that you might consider that the bee house and what was going on at St. Thomas's to be the first apiology research center in Europe. And it fits what we know about meteorology at this time. Mendel now as abbot is a lot more confident than he was when he first came back in the 1840s, and he's doing good work, and he's got an opportunity here. In 1871, he starts meeting monthly with the Moravian Bee Association, and this is the group where we find out about Mendel's apiology. They publish a monthly journal, and while Mendel didn't write any papers for that journal, he's quoted in it throughout its run. We know about his beehives, for example. This is the typical Dzierzon hive. He used Dzierzon hives, or actually they were called Moravian Association hives because they were being built by the local beekeeping society. He also used Christ hives. This is a sort of long rectangular hive with 4 groups where 4 narrow frames would be slid in on tiers with each other. They'd be worked from the back. The Christ hive was a typical bar hive that was box hives like we use today. This is one of the hives at the museum. This was used in Mendel's time. This is the front of the hive. You can't see it, though. It's not dark enough here, but the entrance is right here. This is a platform that could fold down to protect the entrance from rain. Here's the back. So there's a groove here where you'd slide in one set of frames. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 tiers of these rectangular frames. It was worked from the back. Remember, it was worked from the back because you could place that hive in the opening of the bee house, and the beekeeper could work the hive by just taking the door off the back and not interfere with the bees flying in and out of the hive. It was double walled for insulation, but Mendel was not necessarily convinced that insulation was critical. He modified the hive. This is on display at the museum into the single-walled rectangular hive. But what made this hive different was that Mendel started using deeper, more square-shaped frames. So there were 2 tiers of these instead of 4. And Mendel believed that this allowed the bees to build up larger numbers of bees, and he felt that
the stronger and the more heavily populated hives had a better chance of making it through the winter. They were placed, as I mentioned, with the entrances facing out in the bee house. In comparing the bees in the bee house over the winter, those in the cellar, Mendel discovered that indeed having bees in a winter storage cellar didn't help. So he recommended making sure your hives are strong, well populated, you leave enough honey for the bees, and they could get through the winter on their own. Now, Mendel, one of the things about his group is he didn't just use one set of bees. He was very much interested in different races. And he maintained at the bee house not only the black German bee, but the Italian bee, the Cyprian bee, the Egyptian bee, and the Carniolan bee. In 1879, a box of textiles came into Brno, and there found in the box a colony of the stingless bee from South America. So who do you give a colony of bees to in Brno? It was given to Mendel. And he kept these, this tropical bee for at least 2 years. And he kept them warm by pouring boiling water over the hive during the winter months just to keep the temperature up a little bit. They did last for about a year and a half. And there were even people reporting seeing some of the workers working the flowers the following spring. He was very pleased that they overwintered. The bees you see here on the left is the Italian yellow bee, and the black German bee is on the right. Now, as I mentioned, Rell thinks that Mendel was interested in carrying out crosses much like you would see with his peas. And the evidence for it is that he had a fertilization cage built. And this is rather interesting. You're looking at the one on the far upper left is looking at it from the side. That little square down in the right there, that's what this is. It's a brick base in which a colony of bees was placed on top. And the queen was centered and kept in between two frames so she could fly into the cage. The workers and the drones could fly out of the hive. And the idea was Mendel would put selected drones in this cage, hoping that the queen would fly out and he'd be able to get a controlled cross. That was something that was very difficult to do. And indeed, we know that none of his attempts at crossing these strains worked. So since he was unsuccessful using these for his crossing experiments, he appears to have been interested in trying to develop a stronger, more efficient honey-producing bee for the region. So he allowed his various strains to fly wild and let natural selection take its course. And it's thought that he may have been trying to, by bringing different strains and letting them mate with the local populations, that through that process of natural selection, he was trying to do to bees what Father Knapp did with sheep crosses. And one of his more interesting things that he worked on was the foraging behavior of bees. And we're hoping to repeat this experiment at the Mount St. Joe this summer. He would go out at night, which was rare for him because he was always watching sunspots, and he weighed his beehive. He then went out during the next day and every hour counted the number of bees per minute, not the whole hour, but took samples over the course of the day, and then extrapolated the number of bees returning to the hive during the daylight hours. Then he weighed his hive that night to see how much nectar the bees had brought in. And he found that on average they could bring in on a sunny day 6.5 kilograms of nectar per day. Now he had an estimate of the number of bees with nectar loads coming back in, and so he calculated how much nectar an individual bee could carry. And that number was surprisingly accurate. How he did this with probably a platform scale and just counting on the hours is just amazing. So we're going to look at that again this summer to see if we can do as well with modern technology. In 1872, Mendel suffered an outbreak of foul brood. This is a bacterial infection that kills beehives. It's called foul brood because as the bees decay, they give a really disgusting foul smell. And his recommendation, which he reported to the Moravian Beekeepers Association, was that the beekeepers should kill their bees. And indeed, that's the recommendation we use today. If you have bee inspectors still in your state, I started in beekeeping as a bee inspector, and you find a bad infestation. This is a bacterial disease that's not easy to control. It's expected you should kill your bees and even burn the hives. He gave a lecture in 1875 to the society on how to stop mildew in overwintering hives. That's a real problem. If there's a lot of condensation in the hive, mold will start to grow, and that can actually foul the honey and be an issue for bee survival. And in 1877, he reported on the benefits of the different races of bees. And it's, we know all this from the quotations attributed to him in the Honeybees of Brno, which was the publication of the Society. And it's clear from that they keep talking about Father Mendel, constantly referring to comments that he made during the meetings. Some of his quotations, it's important for every beekeeper to carry out experiments, since this is the only way to achieve successful results. He also reported on the races. The Cyprian bee has certain advantages and would be suitable for the attaining of cultured bees by crossing with other bees, the goal of which the whole apicultural world is striving, developing better breeds of bees by crosses. He even commented on how far the bees would forage. They were often, quote, often flying for honey as far as the Red Hill to Pisarchy and even further. They fly a very long way, as far as the Imperial Road, and it is certainly highly demonstrative that a Cyprian drone from Old Brno fertilized a queen from Novula Scofic. So, that's just really cool. He's really into everything on this stuff. So, now Mendel was respected as being abbot of the abbey, but he's also respected for his apiology and his help to promote beekeeping. I think he was encouraging beekeeping much in the same way that Abbot Knapp was doing to encourage wool production and fruit production. Mendel was bringing in new honeybee varieties to provide variation for crosses that would occur in nature, with the expectation that natural selection could help produce a better bee for the region. Beekeeping was an economic opportunity that, if practiced rationally, could provide a valuable income to its applicants. I think it's safe to say that Mendel went to his grave not with the frustration of the inconsistent results he had from his plant hybridization studies, but that he was confident knowing he had made a scientific contribution, not only to meteorology, not only to astronomy, but also in apiology. Thank you.